So we're going to discuss two different types of loops. The first type of loop is called a counted loop. A counted loop, also called a for loop, is your standard loop in programming that will iterate a specific number of times. The second type of loop is a conditional loop. Now a conditional loop, also called a while loop, spell that right, also called a while loop, is a loop that will loop indefinitely until some end condition is met, or it'll continually loop until some condition is not met anymore, and then it'll stop rather. So we're going to focus today on the counted loop, or the for loop. And the reason why we're going to start with this one is probably it's by far the most used type of loop that you're going to use in programming. The while loop serves a purpose, but basically you could recreate a while loop using a counted loop if you really needed to, and vice versa. You could recreate a counted loop using a while loop as well. In any case, so a for loop is made up of four parts, and the four parts of a for loop or a counted loop are as follows. First part is we have define. What are we defining? We're defining a counter variable. That counter variable is going to keep track of how many times we are iterating through the loop. Now, it doesn't keep track of a specific number, it more keeps track of the iteration number that we're on. So a loop may loop 17 times, but that doesn't mean that the counter variable is going to count from 1 to 17. You'll see in a second how we actually break that down, but it becomes more clear very quickly. So the second part is compare. We're going to keep looping by comparing the counter variable against some form of end value. So we're going to compare the counter against an end value. So we're going to keep looping as long as it's the comparison with that end value results in a true. Then next we have the change. We're going to change the counter variable. We're going to change the counter variable in a direction that moves towards the end value. Towards the end value. And the reason why we're doing this is because eventually we want the loop to end. And if we're not going towards the end value, or we don't have somehow approach that value, we're never going to end. We're going to be stuck in what's called an infinite or an endless loop, which defeats the purpose of a counted loop. A counted loop is supposed to loop a specific number of times. And the final part to our for loop is the code itself. So this is the code that executes fully in every single iteration of the loop. And we saw in the previous example in the last module where we were asking the user for a number and then we would store that number. In that loop sequence, that would occur for a specific number of times if we were using a for loop. So let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at some code and see how we can actually break down these four components. So I'm just going to open up Eclipse here. So I'm going to give you a quick little example of how this actually works. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called int total. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a program that's going to add up all the values from 1 to 1,000. Now I don't mean add 1 plus 1,000, I mean all the values in that range, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, and so on and so forth. If we were to do this manually, we would have to do total is equal to total plus 1, and then total is equal to total plus 2, and so on and so forth until eventually we got down to, oops, autocorrect messing with me here. Eventually we would get down to total plus 1,000. Obviously that's a lot of work. I don't want to do that, you don't want to do that, nobody wants to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a loop to simplify this whole situation. Now we see that there's something very consistent. Each one of these lines is basically the same thing. The only thing that changes is this number at the end. 1 becomes a 2, then a 3, then 4, all the way up to 1,000. So I want to make a loop that's going to use this same logic, the same line, but using I'm going to use the counter variable that we're going to create as that number. So let me just quickly write the code for it, and then I'll explain it. For int count is equal to 1, and I want to keep looping as long as count is less than or equal to 1,000, and we're going to modify count by a value of 1 each iteration. Oops. So what we're going to do is, let me just quickly snap back to what we have here. We have our 4 parts. Let me just grab these so we can see them. And I'm just going to put them inside some comments so we can actually view what they actually mean. It's terrible. So basically our first part is define. This is our define right here. We're defining our counter variable. I called it count, but we have to give it a starting value. Now I'm going to be using that counter variable inside of my command here. So I want it to have the same values that each one of these addition values are going to be have, or each one of these addition values are going to have. And this starts at a 1, so I'm going to start my count variable at a 1. Next up is my compare, and I want to keep looping until I get through all 1,000 options. So I'm going to say keep looping as long as count is less than or equal to 1,000. Okay, that's going to help me get all the way through all those different operations. And then finally we have our change statement. Now this is the one that modifies our count variable after each iteration of the loop to work towards our end value. So each one we can see that count is increasing by 1. Count equals count plus 1. Inside of our loop, we're going to do the logic that we had before. Total is equal to total plus, well, what are we going to add to it? We don't add 1 or 2 or anything like that. We're going to add count to it. Now I want you to stop and think for a second how this actually works. Count starts at a value of 1. It's going to test to see whether count is less than 1,000. Yes, it is. It's 1. And then it's going to enter the loop. It's going to do the code. Total is equal to total plus count. Well, total starts at 0. 0 plus count, which is a 1. So 0 plus 1 is 1. Then it's going to store that result back into total. It goes down, gets the end bracket, and it pops back up here and does the change step. And it modifies count. So now count moves from a 1 to a 2. And then it comes back here and does the test again. Is 2 less than 1,000? Certainly is. Goes back into the loop. Total is equal to, well, total was 1 plus 2. Now we're at 3. Store that back into total, and the whole process repeats again. So just to go over this again, it starts the define, and then it does the compare. If the compare is true, it executes the code. At the end of every iteration, it does the change step. At the end of every iteration. And then once it's changed, it tests the value again. Is it still true? If it is, go back in the loop and repeat again. So you can see that these 3 steps here repeat indefinitely until that end condition is met. Or I guess until that end condition is no longer met, I should say. So what we can do is we can actually test this. I'm going to put a breakpoint on here, and I'm going to run in debug mode. Yes, I want to save, and yes, I want to go to debug test mode. And what's going to happen here is it's pausing this line, and I can mouse over the values, and it's going to tell me exactly what the value of each one of these are. So currently, if I look at this, let me just go over to my variables here, sorry. We have total and we have count. Count currently has the value 1. Total has a value 0. It executes this line, and total should have a value 1 now. And now it's modifying count. So as I get through this line, it sets count to 2. And 2 is still less than 1,000, less than or equal to 1,000, and it goes in and it repeats the process. And it's going to keep going through this, and you can see the total changing as I go through these lines of code. Now I'm just going to hit resume. I'm going to get rid of this breakpoint, and I'm going to put another breakpoint right. No, it's not going to let me. That's all right. We'll just let it finish, and we didn't display the actual results. So let's do a quick little output: system.out.print, and we're going to say total. So what we should see at the end of this program is the resulting value of all of that work. So let's just go back to regular view so we can see our code as normal and run. And down in our output window, we should get our total, which is 500,500. That's a nice coincidence. So that is the sum of all the numbers from 1 to 1,000. Now if I didn't want the numbers from 1 to 1,000, maybe I wanted the numbers from 400 to 600. Well, I would give my starting value to 400, and I would give my testing ending value to 600. So that's how we create a basic loop. In the next video, we're going to see how we can modify this to do a few more interesting things.